This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Okay, we need to finally talk about the Cult of Dionysus, or rather all the things around it, because I see a weird load of misconceptions, and rightly so. When I had questions about looking into the Cult of Dionysus, particularly, actually, I went down this avenue because I was like, what about madness in the ancient world? I was really curious about how they perceived madness, and it led me with more questions than answers. So this is where my rabbit hole recently went down. Obviously, a lot of us are familiar with the Cult of Dionysus and the iterations of that in contemporary media and its violent goriness and the idea of being taken over by a god. And yet, divine madness in the ancient world had a very different profile, as it were, or understanding. So I decided to ask, what is madness in the ancient world? How was it perceived? And why is there kind of like more a negative spin around like the Cult of Dionysus and things like that, and how the evolution of madness went that way? So first, I actually want to start back with Plato, which is where I began my journey. So according to Plato, there were three phenomena which all constituted madness. We had rational madness, we had God-driven or divine madness, and then we had madness as a disease, which we now more discuss as mental illness. In the Phaedrus, Plato describes various forms of madness of divine origin, and they bestowed virtue onto mankind. So in her work Plato on Madness, Katia highlights that Plato uses two expressions for madness, aphron and paranoia. So madness to Plato, she explains, is an absence of the usual functioning of the mind. The mad person in ancient Greece was one who was beside himself. What goes on their mind is past comprehension, or it runs alongside the ordinary functions of the mind. But divine madness was not a disease. Madness of divine origin, he argued, was actually superior to sanity. Both the prophet and the poet were seen in antiquity as revealers of truth, though they sort of kind of overstepped the regions of reasons, which is known as logos, because they spoke in odd phrases or used poetic imagery. So the work the poet or the prophet creates is not the result of ordinary thought processes. However, this form of madness still causes positive cognitive activity, and he uses the prophetess of Delphi as one of the examples, as well as the priestess at Dodona and the Sibyl, because yes, whilst these women were not in their right minds, they conferred wondrous things to Greece, which resulted in positive outcomes. Now, to make matters even more complicated, Socrates identified four forms of divine madness, which was prophetic madness, ritual madness, poetic madness, and erotic madness, and each of these forms of madness was inspired by the appropriate deity. So we had Apollo for prophetic madness, Dionysus for ritual madness, the Muses for poetic madness, and Aphrodite for erotic madness. Now, what's important to kind of emphasise here is that Socrates always argued that divine madness was always a cause for good, which, if you're familiar with the Cult of Dionysus and its reputation, that positive perception sounds rather strange. You know, after all, we have a lot of famed examples as well of other sorts of divine madness that stem from mythology. You have the divine madness of Heracles, which, you know, overtook his body, he killed his wife and children, really, really sad. I actually have two videos on Heracles mythology. And then we obviously have the example of ritual divine madness, the one which overtook Agave when she tore her son Pentheus apart with her bare hands, along with the other Maenads, and then carried off his bloody head, as you do. So where did this distinction go from? So how did the reputation of the Dionysian ritual madness become a negative one when Socrates discussed the divine madness as only positive? So, okay, let's look at the Cult of Dionysus. So the earliest evidence of the existence of mystery cults in general is in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which was arguably composed between 650 to 550 BCE. I've done a whole video on Demeter and the Cult of Demeter if you're interested. Now, when it comes to the Cult of Dionysus, Richard Seaford presents a number of primary sources from both Greek and Roman eras. The first piece of evidence is of an Attic vase painting from the 6th century BCE on which the mystery cult of Dionysus is illustrated. However, the source that most of us are probably familiar with is the play by Euripides, which details the founding of the cult of Dionysus and his possession of the Maenads, who subsequently engage in gory deviancy, to say the least. But before I go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything from products to content to time, all in one place and all on your terms. I've gone through many iterations online, from being a blogger to now running my own business, and Squarespace has seen all sides of my online evolution. I've been starting my first ever writing courses online and writing workshops, and I can also host these on my Squarespace website, which allows for members-only content for my community, where I can sell access to online courses or blogs or videos and memberships, and purchases can be anything from a one-time fee to subscription access. And when it comes to evolving my business, I can make smarter business decisions with Squarespace's intuitive built-in analytics tool, which lets me review website traffic or learn where I should focus my engagement and track revenue from bookings, invoices or product sales, all in one place. So if you're interested, check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lady of the Library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So the play The Bacchae was written in the last few years of Euripides' life, and it was first performed posthumously by his nephew as part of a tetralogy in 405 BCE in the city of Dionysium festival. The play begins with Dionysus himself explaining his visit to Thebes, which we soon find out is actually a vindication of himself and his mother. So his mother was a Theban princess named Semele, and she's the daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia. She is shunned from Thebes with her son Dionysus, and as such Dionysus returns not only to avenge his mother, but also avenge the slander that he is not a god. So as the play unfolds, we see how tragedy befalls those who do not believe his mother or his divine status. The madness, which then results in the tragic outcome of Euripides' play, falls under ritual madness, a subcategory of divine madness. Now John Gale briefly touches on this, explaining that Dionysus in Greek literature and myth is represented as an outsider, and women and enslaved people were prominent in the cult of Dionysus, which brought about mad states through disinhibition, in which a casting off of the ego allowed for some kind of temporary social emancipation and catharsis. Now Gale goes on to argue that this sort of cultic letting go of the ego, may have served as a social function of releasing irrational impulses, which might otherwise have come into more destructive forms closer to the polis, as it were. As such, ritual madness was seen as directed towards a cure and thus a positive thing, because we'd rather it happen elsewhere than in the home, in the oikos. But if it was the case that it was better that ritual madness happened away from the oikos, away from the polis, then why was the cult of Dionysus perceived as such a sinister gathering? Well, actually, it's all down to rumours and speculation. Kerpiel posits in his essay that the cult of Dionysus may have deviated from the accepted practices of the day, specifically concerning offerings, sacrifices, and enthusiasmos, which is enthusiasm, and ecstasy. You see, sacrifices and festive behaviours were an occasion for the community to come together in dedication of the gods. So when the cult of Dionysus practiced their rituals away from the populace, suspicions of deviant practices, including sexual misconduct and orgies, began to arise. Additionally, the temporary abstinence from marital sex, that was also reflected in the activities attributed to worshippers of Dionysus, likely ruffled some feathers. There was not as though many men were affected by the latter. The women who were attracted to the cult of Dionysus were largely widowed or those without children, and they had thus been marginalised due to their perceived inability to produce a bloodline. But for these women, the Dionysian cult was awesome, because the Dionysian cult placed emphasis on the measure of women, and those women who failed to meet society's measure of what a woman should be were attracted to religious activities which specifically addressed this concern. But a load of women who are not in their looms, not having children and not having sex, very deviant indeed. As such, the cult of Dionysus cultivated a negative stigma, which is displayed in Euripides' Bacchae. That which deviates from social standards should be demonised, as demonstrated by the tragedy and the chaos which unfolds as the world is turned upside down by Dionysus. Women run away into the madness, away from their shuttles and looms, something which Euripides notably highlights, that as they are strung by this madness, they are secretive and removed from the community of which they belong, and as such, rumour begins to spread. They regress from humans and become wild animals in nature, eating raw flesh. And they become so abnormal that these women have the power to physically overpower men. As you could probably tell from all of that, the hostility towards the cult lies in the repugnance of the reversal of gender roles, in which women are ransacking the villages, and women are defying men, and women aren't performing their duties. And we see this also in the play, because poor Pentheus has to don a linen woman's dress in order to approach and watch the Maenads, and he is thus also dressed as a woman when he dies his brutal and humiliating death. As he's being pinned down by the Maenads, he pleads up at his mother Agave, but she is, quote, foaming at the mouth and rolling her eyes in all directions, not in her right mind, possessed by the Bacchic god, and so Pentheus did not move her. Grabbing his left arm below the elbow, she put her foot against the wretched man's ribs and tore his shoulder out from the socket. She did not do this by her own strength, but the god gave power to her hands. Ino was destroying the other side of his body, tearing his flesh, and Autonoe and the whole crowd of Bacchants took hold of him. They all shouted out together, Pentheus screaming as long as he still had breath, and the Bacchants howling in triumph. One of them was carrying a forearm, one a foot with a sandal still on it. His ribs were laid bare by the tearing, and all the women, bloody-handed, were playing catch with the flesh of Pentheus. Whilst it's particularly gruesome, again, this death of Pentheus cements the idea of a topsy-turvy world. The woman and women who brought this man and other men into the world are the ones that take him out of it through an animalistic massacre. And yet, he is the man, rather than an animal, that becomes the sacrifice for the hubris of thieves, and thus for the god's vindication. Despite his violent death, Pentheus becomes Thebes' saviour. Kulk argues, quote, Euripides may be asking his audience to see clearly, like Agave, the reality, the consequences and the horror of the Dionysiac religion. Whatever his intentions, the negative connotations associated with the cult of Dionysus lived on for 4 centuries after, to be echoed by Livy, and then, centuries after that, to be echoed by authors such as Donna Tartt and popular culture. But originally, all divine madness was good. It was something that brought about goodness to the polis, and technically it did. Pentheus served as a sacrifice which vindicated the god and brought peace to Thebes once again. So in a weird way, it's still a positive thing, but we can see that the Dionysian cult is rooted in suspicion about women and outsiders standing on the edge of the polis doing things that no one can see. But I hope this was also informative to anyone who was curious about how madness was perceived in the ancient world and why there's negativity towards the Dionysian cult. If you have any other suggestions for videos, please let me know. This has been a requested one for a long period of time, but I thought I'd do something a bit more chatty. Hopefully it wasn't as essay-ish as usual, so people don't feel bogged down with my lectures. But I have a Google form down below where you can submit your questions and requests for that. I also have a little podcast, so if you have something that's more chatty, I'm happy to do that on a podcast there. But if you have a request that's far more chatty and far more anecdotal, I also have a podcast, and you can also send requests in for that too. Both Google forms are linked down below. Thank you as always to my Patreons for making this possible, and thank you to my top tier patrons, my librarians, Janice, Eric Taylor, Jenny Edivane, Marina, Psycho Teddy, Fritz Anderson, Wee Lauren, Nicholas Reed and Andrea Bazil. Thank you so much as always, and I hope you are happy and healthy, and books save lives. So keep reading.